So in this session, we're going to be exploring diverse experiences with language policy and in which ways language policy can help to reinforce endangered languages and in which ways it may be deemed detrimental to language preservation. Later, we're going to be opening it up for audience participation and for questions near the end of the session, and we invite you all to talk about your experiences with language policy as well. We have our Spanish translator here who will be joining us and helping to translate for Moises. We have Moises Medrano, who is with the Ministry of Culture in Colombia. He is the head of the Department of Community Relations. Their mission is Intercultural Dialogue in Colombia, so we're glad he could join us. And then next to him, we have Bud Lane, who is a Silitz language expert. He is an educator, a dancer, a regalia maker, a basket maker, and we'll be talking about the Siletz language, which is a Native American language spoken on Oregon's west coast. And then next to him, we have Ruben Reyes, who is of the Garifuna diaspora community. He is associated with the Garifuna Museum in Los Angeles. He's a language teacher, a cultural historian, and a filmmaker. And next to him, we have Owen Ser, who is a Welsh language teacher and a choir director. And next to him, we have Gary Krug, who is a Hawaiian language expert and is involved in education policy in Hawaii. So thank you all for joining us. Maybe we could go around and have people sort of give brief introductions and talk about their experiences with language policy in their communities, sort of the history of language policy and how it's evolved over time. That would be great. So maybe we can go down the line here.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. El Ministerio de Cultura de Colombia agradece al Smithsonian, a la Cancillería y a nuestros portadores de las tradiciones culturales la oportunidad de contar cómo ha venido adelantándose el trabajo de construcción de una política pública cultural.
So we'd like to thank the Smithsonian Institution and the Ministry of Culture and the Consulate of Colombia here for allowing us to bring all of these tradition bearers and cultural experts to allow us to share with you some of the work that we've been doing in Colombia.
Quisiera hablarles como de los 5 asuntos en los que se basa la política cultural lingüística de Colombia. Estos temas forman parte de una apuesta de carácter política del gobierno colombiano y están orientados fundamentalmente a establecer un ejercicio de reconocimiento de los pueblos indígenas y de las comunidades negras que todavía preservan sus lenguas nativas.
So I'd like to speak to you a little bit about the ways in which the Colombian government has formed policies primarily with which to recognize the language communities, primarily the indigenous and the Afro-Colombian languages of our country, and the ways in which our policies have been shaped in order to preserve and recognize these communities.
El primero de los elementos es la existencia de una ley de protección de las lenguas nativas. Tenemos en Colombia 68 lenguas, 65 indígenas, 2 criollas, una pertenece a las comunidades negras de una comunidad que se llama Palenque, que tiene presencia hoy aquí, y la segunda lengua criolla pertenece a las comunidades que están en el Caribe colombiano, que es una lengua que se llama creol.
So in Colombia, one of the first and primary ways that we have preserved language is through a law of language protection. In Colombia, we have 68 languages, 65 of which are indigenous. The last 3 belong to the Afro-Colombian populations, one of which is the language of San Basilio de Palenque, which we have represented behind us in the tent. And the second is of the Afro-Colombian populations in the Caribbean, which is a Creole.
La última de las lenguas pertenece a la comunidad de gitanos en el país. Tenemos alrededor de 5.000 miembros de las comunidades gitanas que fueron reconocidos como parte de los grupos étnicos de Colombia hace alrededor de 4 o 5 años.
The last language is the language of the Roma, or the Gypsy population in Colombia, of which there are about 5,000, which were finally formally recognized as part of the Colombian community about 4 or 5 years ago.
La existencia de la ley de lenguas ha obedecido, que es el segundo elemento que quiero mencionar, a la voluntad política de los gobiernos. Hace 20, 25 años para las comunidades indígenas en Colombia era ilegal hablar en sus lenguas nativas. Ya con una ley de lenguas se abre y se abrió la posibilidad de generar todos los ejercicios de reconocimiento que implica tener una lengua nativa, escribirla o traducir documentos o generar a través de esos documentos un diálogo diferente con las entidades de Estado y de gobierno.
And this language law that we've been discussing really caused a really large shift in the political dialogue in Colombia. About 20, 25 years ago, in many regions, it was illegal or it was prohibited for these communities to speak in their languages. So it's been really important to have this law in place so that we can go about recognizing the various traditions of these communities, allow them to practice speaking these languages, allow them to translate important documents into these languages. So this law has really helped us shape the political dialogue.
La existencia de la ley lo que ha permitido es hablar abiertamente de cómo la religión, especialmente la religión católica, ha sido responsable de la erosión de muchas lenguas, prohibiendo a las comunidades indígenas, en el caso particular de los indígenas, hablar en sus propias lenguas porque era símbolo de prácticas negativas o adversas a la práctica religiosa cristiana.
And so this opening of the political dialogue has really allowed us to reflect on the role of religion in language diversity in communities, particularly the role of the Catholic faith in Colombia, where in many cases, because of missionary work, it was prohibited for these communities to speak these languages because it was believed that it was associated with negative or evil practices. So this has allowed for a lot of reflection in Colombia.
Otro asunto del que podemos ya hablar abiertamente con una ley de lenguas tiene que ver con la vergüenza que sentían muchos miembros de las comunidades indígenas o afrocolombianas que tienen sus lenguas al hablar en sus lenguas. Al no ser la lengua mayoritaria, generaban burlas al interior de la sociedad que ya podemos confrontar a partir de políticas del Estado en este caso.
Another aspect of language diversity that we've been able to openly engage with and openly discuss is the fact that for a long time these communities were ashamed of their languages. Given that Spanish is the dominant language, these minority languages were often openly mocked and people were ashamed to speak their languages. So now that this discourse is out in the open, out in the public, we've been able to directly tackle these issues in our society.
Con la ley de lenguas hemos logrado generar posibilidades de carácter pública, permitir que las comunidades tengan acceso a literatura en sus propias lenguas, no producida a propósito de una mirada subordinada de quiénes son las comunidades, sino en función de la importancia que tiene la literatura para las comunidades. No es el consumo de la literatura de los indígenas porque son indígenas, sino porque son buenos escritores, porque son buenos poetas y porque su conocimiento es valioso para la sociedad.
Additionally, one of the major policy shifts that we've been able to see through this discourse is the implementation of literature in indigenous languages. And this is no longer the consumption of indigenous literature as something exotic or other. This is something that we can value not because this is something indigenous, but because it is something to be valued in its own right, because this is something that is important to the communities themselves.
El tercer elemento tiene que ver con la misión de la dirección que tengo a mi cargo en el ministerio, que es el establecimiento de posibilidades de diálogo cultural. Tenemos en Colombia cada año la posibilidad de hacer una reunión muy grande con comunidades, con pueblos en las principales capitales del país, y son directamente las comunidades quienes establecen el diálogo con los no hablantes.
And so another important role, I'm going to speak in the first person here, but obviously for Moises, one of the important parts of my job, Moises' job, is that we've been able to establish this sort of intercultural dialogue between the communities and the government in the major urban centers of the country, where these communities can themselves bring forth issues that are important to them, and in that way start dialogue that will then shape public policy for the country.
La apuesta fundamental en el ejercicio de diálogo cultural es que las comunidades que tienen aún sus lenguas puedan establecer diálogos con no hablantes. Para nosotros es fundamental que el ejercicio sea entre hablantes de las lenguas y no hablantes, porque esta interacción genera en unos preguntas y en otros una suerte de empoderamiento en el sentido de transmitir sus saberes, contar sus historias y explicarle al resto de la sociedad colombiana quiénes son y cómo han participado históricamente en la sociedad colombiana.
And these intercultural dialogues are very important because they allow for a communication between speakers of these languages and non-speakers, so that they can communicate and share their knowledge, share their stories, share their understandings, and in this way start to work out what each community's place is in the national community, in the national identity.
Para finalizar, los dos últimos elementos son, el primero, el cuarto en este caso sería un trabajo que hemos denominado pueblo a pueblo. En Colombia tenemos 102 pueblos indígenas, la mayoría de ellos en zonas bastante alejadas de los centros urbanos y en riesgo de extinción cultural.
Another important part of this policy has been communication between the different indigenous communities. We have about 102 indigenous communities in Colombia, mostly in the process of endangerment or extinction, and these are often in very remote regions of the country.
Y la posibilidad de trabajo pueblo a pueblo nos permite partir y transformar la relación entre el Estado y los ciudadanos. Nos obliga a adecuar las políticas públicas, hacerlas por cada una de las 102 comunidades y generar un ejercicio de trabajo que permite de verdad transformar esa relación entre los ciudadanos y el Estado. Para finalizar, el último elemento es la creación de experiencias entre los pueblos y los ciudadanos. Para nosotros es fundamental que las comunidades indígenas y las comunidades negras, que todavía son portadoras de la tradición lingüística, dejen de ser considerados objeto de estudio y puedan ser valorados como ciudadanos que pueden interpelar al gobierno, a la sociedad y plantear sus problemas abierta y directamente.
And so it's important that we can have this dialogue between these 102 communities, because in that way we can sort of tailor our public policy to the needs of each individual community. And to sort of wrap up this discussion, it's also important in this policy that we engage directly with this community so that they are now valued as citizens, that they're no longer just the subject of study by scholars, that they are themselves citizens of Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Bud Lane and I come from the Confederate Tribes of Sletz Indians of Oregon. We're a small tribe on the Oregon coast. Our people were brought together on the Sletz Reservation in the 1850s after settlement began in all of Western Oregon. The way that our languages have been affected by different policies were first the federal policy of concentration on the reservation, and after that, after a few years of being on the reservation, most agencies and agents, Indian agents, opened up schools where the children were taken and forced to learn English. And even in my father and grandfather's time, there was a boarding school system set up by the federal government, and many of our people went off to those boarding schools to be what the federal government called civilized and taught English, and our languages were really frowned upon. They were unable to speak the language in those schools, and it had a profound effect on our people and our language. Probably one of the other things that really had an effect on the language was further settlement of our reservation by non-Indians and the societal exclusion. People were made fun of, and people were at a certain point even ashamed and rarely spoke our language out in public, only amongst themselves. And so there were many federal policies that led and contributed to the demise of and the restriction on languages. However, those policies eventually began to change into the 80s and into the 90s, where there were successive laws passed, and the federal government, through different agencies and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, actually started offering funding to help native languages survive. We also deal with our own tribal policies and state policies. We're in the process right now of providing curriculum in a Siletz Valley School, right in the town of Siletz on the reservation, that we're teaching the Dene language up to the 6th grade. We're moving it on into the 7th and 8th this fall, and hopefully next year into the high school curriculum. And it's still called the foreign language requirement, the 2-year foreign language requirement. And we tried to talk with the state about that. They weren't interested, but I'm more interested in teaching the language, whether they call it domestic or foreign. So there's an array of policies, state, local, county, tribal, and federal, that affect our ability to teach, and sometimes enhance it, sometimes restrict it. And so we're plowing ahead with our language programs. We have many young kids in the Siletz Valley School. There's about 260 that attend school there who are receiving instruction reinforced daily in the language. So we're very happy about that. We also teach community classes in the adjacent areas of the Willamette Valley, which are about 150 miles from the reservation where many of our members live. So it's kind of a mixed bag with policy. The previous policies of the state and federal governments were to virtually stamp out our language. That's reversed now, and we're beginning to benefit from the new policies, and we're very happy about that. Thank you.
In 1797, Garifuna people were exiled from the island of St. Vincent to Honduras, to Central America. Those who remained in St. Vincent were forbidden by policy of the government from speaking the language. Therefore, they forgot the language totally and most of their culture. Those who are exiled are surviving today in the Central American area, Nicaragua, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras. And actually, the government also imposed policies to forbid the Garifuna people from speaking their language in schools. And we had to do everything possible to continue the speaking of the language in the village. And 216 years later, which is today, we still speak the language, we still practice our culture. But we have seen a diminishing in the amount of people that speak the language. The children are, at some points, are more speaking Spanish because that's what they see on television, that's what they see everywhere. And you know, we are in danger of losing our language and subsequently our culture. So what it is that we are doing, the government has a new policy now to be able to have the bilingual education in the school system, where 80% of the language will be Garifuna and 20% of it will be taught in Spanish. That's going to be from day one up to the point they go to college. That, if it gets implemented, because another problem we're facing is that we don't have any materials and not teachers prepared for the task. And in our communities, there are teachers that are not Garifuna, and those, they feel that this policy is going to be a threat for their professions because they've been teaching in the Garifuna community for so long. But at the same time, they have not been able to learn the language, even though they teach there for more than 20, 30 years. They haven't been learning the language, so now they want to oppose the policy from coming to reality for the communities. We believe that that will also help the recovery and reinstatement of the language if we were to receive classes, to teach the language in school primarily. What we are doing as a population, as a member of the population of the Garifuna community, taking upon our own responsibility to develop materials needed for the preservation of the language, such as dictionaries. We have a trilingual dictionary that is useful for Honduras, Belize, because Belize speak Garifuna English. Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala speak Garifuna Spanish. And we also have it available on the website, you know, Garifuna Institute. And we see that we may have to form our own organization or our nation. I've been talking with people in the Central American region, with the heads of those organizations that are representative of the Garifuna people in each one of the countries, as well as here in the United States. And what is being talked is about the revival of the Garifuna nation. The Garifuna nation that was exiled has remained as one people, even though we are now dispersed in 4 countries in the Central American region. So we're talking about restructuring that legally to be able to raise our voices to our governments in order for them to implement what the law said if it's going to be bilingual education in our countries.
Well, pnawn da, good afternoon to those of you who've arrived halfway through. My name is Owen Ser, and I work for the University of South Wales in South Wales, funnily enough. And now then, the situation in Wales, with the union between England and Wales, I forget the exact date, but 500 years ago or more, at that time the official language of Wales became English, which meant that for any official job you had to be an English speaker. So you're automatically excluded if you're a Welsh speaker at that time. But the language of the people remained the Welsh language until the Industrial Revolution, with the advent of the mining, where you had a very large influx to South and certain parts of North Wales, from Ireland, from England, and from further afield. Now, that meant that certain areas became very anglicised. Looking back, if the language had officially been Welsh, then incomers would have learned the language, but it wasn't, and they didn't. Now, gradually then, in the last 100 years ago, the Welsh-speaking heartlands have been eroded, and the two main problems are, first, employment. There is nothing for Welsh speakers in the heartland, so they have to move. This has been going on since at least the 1950s. They used to, at that time, typically go to England. Now, that still happens, but they're often remaining in Wales, but they're moving to the capital. I'll come back to that. So there's a loss of the Welsh speakers from those areas. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of influx to Wales from England. That's one part. If I talk now briefly about the education system, around the 1950s became the first Welsh medium schools, and those have gradually grown in number since then. To illustrate that briefly, 3 brothers, I'm the youngest in my family. We all went to different schools because new schools were opening up one after the other. That's secondary. In primary school, all of us went to the same school, which grew and grew and grew. In 1981, then that split into 4, and it's gone on to split, to increase. There's about 16 or 17 Welsh medium primary schools in the capital. So it looks very encouraging, but the thing is, it's possible to go through school and learn the language in terms of understanding it passively, but not actually able to speak it. At the end of the day, the language that people had at home is the one they're going to speak to their own children when they have them. So on the one hand, it looks quite rosy because we are getting more and more people learning Welsh at school. What I do is I teach in what's called Welsh for adults. We've got classes out in the community, and it's not compulsory. It's good fun, and a lot of people come who are very positive about it, but not all of them will reach fluency, as you can imagine. If you look at the various parts of the picture, some of them look very positive, but the 2 things I mentioned earlier, the exodus of Welsh speakers from Wales and the reverse of English speakers coming into Wales, means that the language is very much in danger. Now, policy, Welsh is now an official language alongside English, in theory, Of course, it doesn't happen. Everybody can speak English. Only roughly 20% of the population can speak Welsh. And in the last census last year, it was shown that the number was actually going down despite a lot of effort and a lot of money that's been poured into it. So forgive me for being pessimistic. My feeling at the moment is it's like pumping the water out of the Titanic after she hit the iceberg, and it's not working. So unless the government actually uses the legislation and enforces it so that we do something to protect those heartlands, it's going to die. I don't know when it's going to die, but it's going to die. So unless something is done quickly, it's bye-bye.
Aloha kākou. My name is Kalihua. I work at the University of Hawaii at Manoa in the College of Education. So I'm going to build some context for Hawaii too, but my spin is going to be an educational one. Everything for us, language policy in the monarchy days prior to 1893 was that Hawaiian was the medium of all governmental discourse. And upon the arrival of U.S. gunships and American businessmen in 1893, the illegal overthrow of our kingdom occurred. 3 years after that, in 1896, the Republic of Hawaii, led by those who illegally occupied Hawaii and still do to today, created a policy that changed the discourse and the governmental usage of language in all governmental issues and engagements to English. And that also included the government schools. So from 1896 till 1978, the decline of Hawaiian language took place because of that one policy. So if back home, we pinpoint that 1896 policy that in 1898 was adopted by the United States when they annexed Hawaii, and all the way through to 1959, and the Constitution of that annexed time period became the Constitution of the state at that time. That 1896 ban on Hawaiian language went from that period until the Constitutional Convention of 1978, which then turned the tide and started the resurgence and reinvigoration of Hawaiian language in Hawaii. In our Constitution now, we have two official languages, Hawaiian language and English. So from that time till now, I think that the most noteworthy for this particular event and where I'm sitting in a relationship to the capital is federal policy. So now you have educational policy, because back home we have immersion schools, and everything that was said here is basically similar to our context as far as the result. However, now we have issues of federal policy bucking heads with state policy. So we have an official language of the state as a native language as an official language of the state. So what we're trying to do is get the state to resource both languages equitably, and not equally, but equitably, so that we thrive in the same way. English and Hawaiian aren't competing, but at home resources they're all going to English. And so in the No Child Left Behind Act, the English Secondary Education, Elementary Secondary Education Act, 2001, there are sections in there about Hawaii. Section 7 talks about Native Americans, Alaskans, and Hawaiians, and gives a whole beautiful write-up, but it doesn't mean anything. So in federal policy, we're recognized as having our language stripped. It talks about the 1993 signing of Bill Clinton of the Apology Bill, recognizing the illegal overthrow of our government and the detrimental actions that subsequently occurred as a result. However, the policy still buckheads, as in Section 1, you're given 4 years to be proficient enough in English, no matter what language you're taking, to have to be assessed. So what I think today, the policy that I wanted to bring up was something that's dear to my heart, and it's controlling the assessments, because I think the Titanic analogy that was brought up is that assessment is a part of the sinking ship. Is that even though they can say, oh yeah, 2 official languages, you can have, I allow you to have immersion schools through Board of Education policy and state educational policy. But yet, they're always pointing back to all of the US DOE says this, the US DOE. So when the state uses the federal government as a scapegoat, then you create, that's when you throw the wrench into the pump, and the pump can't pump the boat. So in Hawaii, I know there have been many presentations about, Hawaii we got them, we're alive, but really we're on a sinking ship, in my opinion. It's the same situation, and the more and more the state defers to the federal government and scapegoats through policy, the less control the Hawaiian language speakers have on their education system. Because what we're seeing now is actually in the schools, because of policy, the teachers are changing curriculum, principals are changing their rationale for decision making. The bureaucratic hierarchy that goes all the way to the superintendent, all the decisions are made, but my hands are tied. The federal government says this, my hands are tied. And the federal government won't even hear it. Mahalo.
Thank you all so much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you all so much for sharing your experiences with us. It's really fascinating. Something that I thought was really interesting was there seemed to be a lot of commonalities between policy being working historically towards marginalization and exclusion, and then gradually there's been a greater acceptance of diversity and an opening up of language policy to be more progressive. We've also heard a lot about the interconnections between educational policy and language policy. I think that's been a really interesting reoccurring theme, is the crucial role that education plays in the transmission process and influencing language policy. We've also heard a lot about power relations and how language policy relates directly to power relations, to minority-majority relationships, and intercultural dialogue within various communities. We've heard a lot of focusing on youth and transmission process and education. We've also heard a lot about the different levels of policy, which I thought was interesting. There are very local policies, there are tribal policies, there are state policies, national policies, and those relationships I've found to be really interesting. Perhaps we can open this up now to the audience. I wonder if anyone would like to share their experiences with language policy, maybe if they have questions for any of our participants, and if there are any comments about their experiences resonating with you, we'd love to hear that. So please raise your hands high. Okay. We'll start over here with this woman, then we'll go to you and to James. Yeah.
I'm just noticing a lot of the movement seems to be focused on education and starting in the schools and the youth. I'm wondering if there's been any movement for cultural policy towards media and putting things into pop culture to garner interest that way.
Would anyone like to take that? So this was a question about the role of media and what role that plays in cultural policy. Would anyone like to take that question?
Yeah, I think media is very important for the propagation of a language. We have developed a system in our villages. Some of the villages have acquired communal radios that reaches the radius of the community itself. And we try our best to speak and communicate news in our language. It's not 100% in our language, but it does help because people tune into that one to be able to hear their songs in Garifuna, to be able to hear news in the Garifuna language. On the other hand, we have expanded to have the content of this dictionary online. So, and beside that, we also have a Garifuna online television called Gari TV, where we post a lot of videos. Some of them are in the Garifuna language. It are news about the villages and towns and so forth. At the same time, we implement the education by teaching it in class, and we were broadcasting at one point live from California, and a lot of people were tuning in. So we found that very helpful, because people were really absorbing and calling for more questions and wanting to do more. So we believe that there is a need to do something a little bit more formal about putting our language out there, but all those requires a little bit more than what our packet can do.
En el caso de Colombia, lo que hemos tenido que hacer con los medios de comunicación es educarlos. Confunden dialecto con lengua o utilizan de manera peyorativa ciertas expresiones de carácter lingüística. Entonces, el trabajo con los medios ha sido educarlos, como introducirlos en los elementos básicos del mundo de la lingüística.
So some of the work that we've been doing in Colombia has been educating sort of the larger media elements to use linguistic terminology a little more sensitively, appropriately. It's very common for broadcasters to use the term dialect versus language in sort of a pejorative sense. So this type of linguistic education has been really important to us in terms of our relations with the media.
Thank you. Should we take the next question? Yes, that's you.
Project.
Sure, and I'll repeat it.
Well, actually, my original question was going to be something related to media, but more in terms of literary expression. If you think of if you ask people who were the great Welsh writers, they would be people who wrote in English. And some years back, I met a poet in Malawi, a Southern African country, that has a lot of very good poets, and they were all writing in English. And then there was one gentleman, and I asked him why he writes in English, and he said it's because the language that he speaks, the people he could communicate with as a poet, as a writer, are such a small number of people, and it's natural for any writer to want to communicate with more people. So, I mean, that's not a policy issue, and it's not even a media issue so much as sort of it's a literary issue, it's an economic issue, people wanting to consume literature in their own country, and, I think Wales is a very good example of that.
May I? Yeah, thank you for that. Certainly what's happened has been very interesting. If we go back a little bit, well, people used to, at university and elsewhere, they would talk about the Welsh language through the medium of English. And some of these people, I mean, their English language skills were not like their Welsh ones, but they had to struggle to do it that way. Even the National Eisteddfod, which is our major literary and arts festival, used to be conducted until the 1950s through the medium of English. A lot of people are absolutely gobsmacked when you say that. They can't believe it. But that's the case. So until the advent of the Welsh medium schools in the 1950s, very little officially was ever done through the medium of Welsh. But that's changed. Recently, when you look at Facebook and you compare the use that different language groups make of it, the amount of usage by Welsh speakers is very, very high. And they do actually use the Welsh language. Having said that, from my personal perspective, I see a lot of people who I know are from Welsh-speaking families, and they're putting up notes on Facebook for their brothers and sisters through the medium of English. And because my work is to promote the use of Welsh, it's really, really frustrating to see first language speakers who aren't bothering to use it. Oh, but somebody might not understand. It's so rude to speak Welsh. I mean, welcome to minority languages. That's what we're used to. But still, a lot of people do find use for that channel, and it is encouraging that lots of them do use the Welsh language. If I can just point back to the earlier question, we do have a Welsh language television channel which was set up in 1981. It's called S4C, if you'd like to Google it. You can get it online. And that's good, but on the other hand, it does mean that you're pushed aside in a way, because in Wales you always had to choose whether you wanted Welsh medium or English medium, and if people maybe have a passive knowledge of the language, then they would automatically choose the English channel, and they would lose the opportunity then to hear the language. So if it's out of sight, it really is out of mind. So that's discouraging. On a positive note again, Welsh pop music and pop groups are very much on the rage at the moment. They have been since the 1970s and before, and also choral music in the last 10 years that's mushroomed and blossomed, if you can have those two things at the same time. So yes, it's a mixed bag, some good and some bad.
All right, Thanks a lot. We have about 2 more minutes, so we can quickly take James's question, and then we'll have to close. So.
Our Welsh participants seem to suggest that there's an economic empowerment issue with regard to language. That is, in the heartland, there are no jobs, and therefore people who carry the language leave. I wonder if that is a cross-cutting question in all communities where there is no self-determination in terms of your economic production and control of your life, your culture, and everything else begins to flow.
So the question is about economy and the role of economics in language revitalization and language preservation. So.
Sorry, I've misunderstood. I thought you were asking the other participants if they had a similar situation to mine.
Yes.
Right.
Is it a cross-cutting issue?
Interpreting what you said correctly.
Yeah, oh, certainly, yes, you were. Thank you, yes.
I'll jump in because everybody back home, we always get this question. So even as a teacher, educator, everybody thinks that if you're going to use Hawaiian language, you're going to be a teacher and you got to go teach in immersion or you got to go teach at the university. So everybody thinks that that has to be the case. But I don't know about policy, but I know that as the population of Hawaiian speakers grows, there's gonna be a necessity for that type of communication, and that to me is the part that if we engage in language learning as a larger community, then we can start to create different realities. But yes, as of right now, the concern is, but there's no professional, there's no professional position when I finish getting my degree in this content area.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to wrap things up. You're all welcome to continue the discussion after our session here, but I want to thank everyone so much for participating, and the audience as well. You've been great, so
thank you
very much.
Diolch yn fawr, many thanks.